Nearly 2 pounds of marijuana lay in a coffin for 27,000 years and stayed green. Next to it, a blue-eyed man who was sent into the afterlife with this stash. In the ancient deserts of western China, archaeologists opened a 27,000-year-old tomb. Inside lay a blue-eyed man around 45 years old. He was buried with a harp, a set of horse bridles, and almost 2 pounds of marijuana, which, somehow, remained green 27 centuries later. This burial site belonged to a shaman, and the cannabis was a kind of travel gift, a supply for the journey into the next world. Whoever prepared this grave clearly wanted the deceased to lack nothing after death. But this man wasn't the first to use the plant. The story goes back some 12,000 years. Somewhere in East Asia, people were just beginning to practice agriculture, and one of the first plants they turned to was cannabis. Imagine an ancient farmer realizing this plant could make rope, weave clothing, be used for food, pressed for oil, and applied in medicine. It wasn't just a crop, it was the ancient Swiss army knife of plants, growing right out of the ground. One of the earliest mentions of cannabis comes from an ancient Chinese text called the Shen Nong Ben Cao Jing. It's often called one of the world's first medical books, and its authorship is traditionally credited to the legendary Emperor Shen Nong. In this book, cannabis was recommended for almost everything, from joint pain to malaria. From China, cannabis spread along the Silk Road. Merchants carried silk, spices, and apparently weed. One trade route went straight through the Pamir Mountains in Central Asia, and it was there that the oldest evidence of cannabis smoking appeared. High in those mountains, at a burial site called Jirzhankal, researchers excavated 8 ancient tombs dating to around 500 BC. Inside, they found wooden braziers filled with charred stones used for burning cannabis. And this wasn't just some wild grass growing nearby. It was potent, much stronger than local wild varieties. People had deliberately chosen a more powerful strain. They heated stones, placed cannabis on top, and inhaled the smoke together during funeral rites. Essentially, they were holding ancient smoky funeral ceremonies 2,500 years ago. Around the same time, the Greek historian Herodotus traveled through Central Asia and encountered nomads he called the Scythians. These were legendary warriors. They rode horses, carried bows, and apparently loved smoky rituals. Herodotus watched them set up small tents, throw cannabis onto red-hot stones, and inhale all the smoke. And he recorded it in his own words. It smolders and gives off such vapors that no Greek steam bath could surpass it. The Scythians, he said, were delighted. For a long time, historians thought he was exaggerating. But in 1947, Soviet archaeologist Sergei Rudenko excavated frozen burial mounds in Siberia that had been sealed in permafrost for over 2,000 years. Inside, they found tent frames, heated stones, and cannabis seeds. Exactly what Herodotus had described. He hadn't made it up. Then, in 2013, another Scythian burial in the Caucasus Mountains yielded 7 pounds of golden bowls. When the residues inside those bowls were analyzed, they contained cannabis and opium. Ancient warriors were mixing substances in golden vessels 2,400 years ago. But an even stranger discovery came 7 years later at Tel Rehov in Israel. Researchers examined the altars of an ancient sanctuary in the Kingdom of Judah, about 2,700 years old, and found something intriguing. One altar held frankincense, a typical sacrificial incense. The other contained cannabis mixed with animal dung to slow the burn and control the smoke. That means whoever prepared the ritual knew exactly what they were doing. And it wasn't just them. Every culture that encountered this plant found a reason to keep it around, because the human body was already wired for it long before the first contact. We naturally produce a molecule called anandamide, named after the Sanskrit word for bliss. Cannabis creates a chemical compound that fits into the same receptor, like the body already had its own lock, and the plant handed it a spare key. That's why in India, this plant wasn't just used, it was worshipped. India has used cannabis longer than almost anywhere else. In their oldest sacred text, the Atharva Veda, cannabis is listed as one of 5 sacred plants. And Lord Shiva, one of Hinduism's chief gods, is known as the Lord of Bhang, a drink made from cannabis leaves and milk. Legend says that after Shiva swallowed a poison that could have destroyed the world, it was bhang that brought him back to a state of calm. And to this day, this drink is prepared during Holi and Shivaratri, nearly 3,000 years later. But the story doesn't end there. The plant kept traveling. In China, around 200 AD, a physician named Hua Tuo mixed cannabis with wine, gave it to his patients, and performed surgeries while they felt nothing, 1,800 years before modern anesthesia. But being ahead of your time is always risky. Hua Tuo was summoned by Cao Cao, one of the most powerful warlords in Chinese history. Cao Cao suffered from crippling headaches, and Hua Tuo was the only one who could help him. But the physician wanted to go home. He wanted to practice medicine and treat ordinary people, not be a personal doctor to a warlord for life. Cao Cao took it as an insult. Hua Tuo was arrested, thrown in prison, and executed. Before his death, he tried to pass his notes to a prison guard, but the guard was too afraid to take them. So Hua Tuo burned everything himself. The formula died with him, and no one has ever been able to recreate it. There's also a story that sounds almost too wild to be true. In the Congo, a warlike tribe discovered cannabis and did something unexpected. They stopped fighting, stopped killing, and rebuilt their entire way of life around the plant. They renamed themselves the Baya Riamba, Sons of Hemp, and called their territory Lubuku, meaning friendship. Their greeting became the word moyo. It meant two things at once, hemp and life. For them, there was no difference between the two. By the time Europeans started colonizing the Americas, cannabis had been a staple of European agriculture for centuries. It kept ships afloat, ropes, rigging, and sails were made from it. An entire age of exploration was partly held together by hemp fiber, the fiber of the cannabis plant. So when settlers arrived in the New World and brought hemp cultivation with them, it wasn't some cultural statement. It was just practical, like bringing wheat. The plant spread quickly through the colonies, but there was a problem. Tobacco was more profitable, and farmers chose it over hemp. The authorities kept asking them to grow hemp, but nobody wanted to do something that paid less. Eventually, the Virginia Assembly stopped asking and passed a law making it mandatory. Farmers were legally required to grow the plant. Not by choice, by law. That's how important it was. For the next 2 centuries, cannabis was part of American life. But everything changed in 1930 when Harry Anslinger became head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He held that position for 32 years. Anslinger linked cannabis to Black Americans, Mexicans, and Filipinos, claiming it made minorities forget their place. He was also obsessed with jazz, calling it satanic music and going after the people who played it. He personally targeted Billie Holiday, not over drugs, but for her song Strange Fruit, a protest against lynchings that pissed off powerful people. He stopped calling the plant cannabis and started calling it marijuana because the word sounded foreign, and that was exactly the point. He kept a folder of fabricated police reports called the Gore Files, linking weed to violence and insanity. He asked dozens of doctors what they thought about cannabis. Most said it wasn't dangerous, but he ignored them and picked the one who agreed with him. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. In 1970, Nixon put it in Schedule 1, the same category as heroin. A plant people had been growing before the invention of writing was now legally considered one of the most dangerous substances on Earth. Then there's another detail that explains a lot. Years later, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, said something in an interview that laid it all out. He admitted the administration wanted to go after 2 groups, anti-war protesters and Black communities. They couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or to be Black, but they could link marijuana to one group, heroin to another, criminalize both substances, and arrest the people they wanted. That's not speculation. That's a direct quote from the guy who helped build the system. In 1988, DEA Judge Francis Young spent 2 years reviewing all the medical evidence and concluded marijuana should not be in the same category as heroin. He recommended removing it from Schedule 1. The DEA rejected his recommendation and kept things as they were. Cannabis has been part of human life for 12,000 years. It's been banned for about 90. That's less than 1%. For almost all of history, this plant was just there. You made ropes out of it in the morning and burned it at funerals in the evening. Entire tribes rebuilt their world around it and greeted each other with a word that meant both hemp and life. And that shaman from the desert, with the harp and 2 pounds of weed, knew nothing about schedules of banned substances or political games. He just knew this plant was worth keeping, and the people who loved it made sure he'd have everything he needed in the next life.